Okay, good morning, good afternoon. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome our audience and our honored guest, Sherri Goodman, to this webinar on the nexus between climate change and national security, where we will be discussing Sherri's new book, Threat Multiplier. My name is Duncan DePledge. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations, Politics and History at Loughborough University in the United Kingdom, where I'm currently leading a research project looking at the implications of climate change and the global energy transition for future military operations. In this capacity, I've been delighted, thanks also to the efforts of Dr. Tamira Santos, that we've been able to strike up a partnership with the Centre for Sovereignty and Climate to produce a series of webinars over the past year, examining different aspects of the climate, energy, national security nexus. The recordings and reports of these meetings are all available from the link that will be posted into the chat. We're now very excited to be extending our work with the Centre for Sovereignty and Climate, together with the support of the War College, the Defence College, and the School of Command and General Staff of the Army in Brazil, to ensure that climate and energy are recognised as priority concerns for the international security community, and to amplify voices around these issues as we look ahead towards COP30 in Brazil next year. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I will now hand over to Mariana.
Thank you, Duncan. It's with great pleasure and honor that I welcome you all to today's event. I would like to extend a special thank you to Sherri Goodman for accepting our invitation and being with us. The nexus between climate change and security is a topic that remains relatively new in Brazil. However, the extreme events that we experienced in 2024, along with the spread of transnational crime in the Amazon region, which is directly connected to environmental crimes and deforestation, the primary sources of carbon emissions in Brazil, highlight the critical importance of understanding the defense sector role in this dialogue. Since its establishment in 2022, the Sovereignty and Climate Center has been dedicated to promoting dialogue between professionals and academics in the environmental sector and those in the security and defense sectors. Our mission is to comprehend the implications of climate change on security and defense, and to foster collaboration between two sectors that have not traditionally engaged on these issues and have often viewed each other with mistrust. In this endeavor, we have been fortunate to partner with esteemed institutions that are dedicated to study security, defense, development, and climate change. It is a great honor and pleasure to collaborate with Loughborough University, whose experienced researchers have significantly enriched our efforts. This event marks the fifth in what we anticipate will be a series of many more initiatives to promote discussions and research, as Duncan anticipated. We are also grateful for the support of other institutions contributing to the advancement of this research: the Brazilian War College, represented here by Professor Jacinto, the Brazilian Defense College, represented here by Professor Cintieni, and also the postgraduate program of the Army College, represented here by Professor Rubens Duarte, and finally, King's College London, represented here by Professor Rafael Camargo. Our program today will begin with Sherri's keynote lecture. Following her presentation, we will hold a question and answer session moderated by Professor Tamira Santos. Sherri, once again, thank you for accepting our invitation. It's a profound honor to have you with us today. Allow me to introduce Sherri Goodman. She is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and Polar Institute, and the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She's renowned for educating a generation of US military and government officials about the nexus between climate change and national security, coining the term threat multiplier to fundamentally reshape the national discourse on this critical issue. In her new book, Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security, Sherri provides an insider's perspective on the military efforts to address global security challenges posed by climate change, a narrative that is both helpful and urgent. The book takes us onto the battlefield and inside the Pentagon to illustrate how the US military is confronting climate change head-on. Over 30 years ago, when Sherri becomes the Pentagon's first chief environmental officer, few could have imagined the armed forces playing this role. Her unparalleled expertise positions her uniquely to answer today's most pressing questions about climate change and national security, how military leaders' thinking has evolved, what their contingency plans are, and where they anticipate future conflicts may arise. Sherri's book is essential reading for anyone interested in gaining a deeper understanding of this topic. We are pleased to announce that Island Press is offering a 20% off discount today when you use the code THREAT on their website. We will share this information in the chat for your convenience. Without further ado, Sherri, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mariana. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you, Duncan and Tamaris and all of you. I am very pleased, very personally pleased with this partnership. I think it's so important. And so it's a pleasure really to be with you today. And thank you. I think that's the last slide, Mariana. So we'll go to the top. And here's the first slide. So the book Threat Multiplier is both my story and the story of the military's environmental and climate journey over the last 30 years plus as I have lived it. And I will say for those of you, since so many of you are joining from Brazil, that I was privileged all the way back in 1996, I believe, to hold the first Western Hemisphere Defense Environmental Conference with the leaders of the region, with our then Southcom commander, who was General Wesley Clark. That's many, many moons ago now, but from that launched a continued engagement, and I think it's much, much stronger today. And I'm so pleased to see this partnership that you have between your Centre for Sovereignty and Climate in Brazil, along with the various UK universities. And I will say now, and we'll come back to it, I hope that if you aren't already members of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, you will also think about joining us in this journey. Okay, let's get started on this journey. Next slide, if you would, Mariana. This is the roadmap for the discussion today: the birth of environment and climate security, how we got started, how we look at regional risks through the eyes of generals and admirals all around the world, how militaries can lead by example on climate resilience and clean energy, and what we all need to do in the future to climate-proof security. Okay, next slide. The basic thesis is this, that throughout the last 50 years, since the beginning of the Cold War, we have seen a convergence between climate change, environment, and national security. So on the top, if you see the major markers of what we would call national or international security, NATO, the Warsaw Pact, then on into, as we get to the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then 9/11. And I will concede to you all here, Brazilians, that this is probably much more of a Americentric view here, but you can think of your own markers along here, and then on into the COVID era. And then on the bottom, we see the rise of environmental and then climate awareness and action in the US, from the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and major environmental laws to the international efforts through the UN Environmental Program, the International Panel on Climate Change, the Montreal Protocol, of course, going back to the Rio Earth Summit, and then on into the Paris Climate Agreements, and to today, where really the distinction climate security is international or national security. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Next slide, Mariana. Thank you. Okay, a little bit about my own personal history. So I started out in the Cold War working on the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee. I had oversight of our nuclear weapons complex, which in the 1980s, we were still producing fissile materials for nuclear weapons. And during that time, all of the weapons reactors we had in the U.S. failed for environment, safety, and health reasons. And I say my career went from weapons to waste. So I really started out in the sort of core of the national security focus areas of the Cold War: arms control, national nuclear weapons and arms control. Those were sort of the core national security threats. And then I migrated to environment where we see that has become one of the most important challenges we face today. Next slide. Great. Now I'm going to tell you about the 1990s in the Department of Defense. I served for 8 years as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security during the administration of President Clinton and President Gore. And Vice President Gore. And there were 3 themes of that era. This is really the first era where the militaries in the 1990s were confronting environmental challenges. So 3 slides here. The first one is about cleaning up contamination from past industrial activities. This is me 30 plus years ago running with President Clinton when we were at a military base in California that we were closing, and President Clinton wanted us to fast track the cleanup. And we had to figure out in the Department of Defense how we were going to do that so we could clean up contaminated military property and return it for civilian use in communities around the country. And that led to a whole era of partnering with environmental agencies in the US that the Department of Defense had previously had quite adversarial relationships with. So instead of litigating and suing us, we reached out. In fact, I even transferred funding out of the defense budget to EPA in that era. So EPA, our Environmental Protection Agency, could hire enough staff to keep up with the pace of cleanup that the president wanted to meet his commitment to communities. So and we let environmental critics into the Department of Defense. So think about that today. You know, we have critics of all kinds of environmental activities. And Department of Defense at that time and militaries around the world were seen as environmental laggards. And I let some of the first environmental non-governmental organizations come in and meet with me at the Pentagon. And they said, oh, well, nobody's ever invited us in. And by building that trust, even if they didn't always agree with us, it led to a new era of partnership and cooperation. Okay, next slide. Part of the second theme of this era was not only cleaning up from the past, but was protecting the natural resources. Now, that obviously seems obvious to you, I'm sure, in Brazil, because you have such abundant natural resources throughout the nation. In the United States, military bases are islands of nature. They have been protected from development, and therefore they hold important endangered species and fragile ecosystems. In the 1990s, this red-cockaded woodpecker pictured on the slide, an endangered bird that actually just in the last year came off the US endangered species list, made its home mostly on military bases in the US Southeast. And the military had been cutting down the tree where the bird makes its nest in the training area. And so training had been stopped for failure to protect the habitat of the bird. And the Army and the Marine Corps in this era had to figure out how to continue training and protect the bird at Fort Bragg, now called Fort Liberty, the home of our Special Operations Forces and others. And so the Army and Marine Corps figured out that rather than cutting down the tree, they could actually turn the tree into a realistic training obstacle that enabled military training to be enhanced, even improved, and at the same time protect the habitat. That theme occurs again today as we look at how we decarbonize our military and enhance military effectiveness. Okay, next slide. The third theme of this era is about partnering with militaries around the world. I already mentioned that in this era, and I don't have a slide on it. I came to, we did an environmental security cooperation with, in the Western Hemisphere with Southcom. One of the most, active efforts we had at this time was with the former Soviet Union, with Russia, to help them reduce their nuclear waste and nuclear and fissile materials. We had a program called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation, where we built this cask you see pictured in white on the slide, so that liquid waste streams from decommissioned and sunken Russian submarines in the Kola Peninsula would not contaminate Norwegian fishing grounds, and we could safely offload those liquid waste streams into this white cask and ship it inland for safer storage. That was an example of military to military environmental cooperation that occurred, and much of that occurs today, led through the U.S. in the U.S. through the combatant commands, but through other forms too, particularly the International Military Council on Climate Security. We conduct engagements around the world with militaries to enhance training and effectiveness and environmental and climate security. Okay, next slide. Okay, on into the climate era. In the mid-2000s, after I left the Defense Department, I joined a think tank called the Center for Naval Analysis, and I gathered the first group of U.S. generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change. And in 2007, we released this report, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, where we said that projected climate change poses a serious threat to America's national security and acts as a threat multiplier, title of my book, the term I coined at that time, threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. And we also projected that climate change would add to tensions even in stable regions. Of course, we see that every day now with fires, floods, more terrifying typhoons, intense hurricanes, and beyond. And we also connected climate change, national security, and energy independence as a related set of global challenges. Next slide. So you know the threat multipliers, dramatic heat rise we've seen around the world, prolonged drought, fires, sea level rise, flooding, storms, permafrost thaw and melt in the Arctic, and beyond. Next slide. And it's not only the physical perils we face, but it's how they interact, the first and second order effects, leading to prolonged food insecurity, energy insecurity, water scarcity, increased disease exposure, and ecosystem degradation that then exacerbates already weak governance, inequality and poverty, varying demographics, and leading to uncoordinated migration that then increases the risk of instability and conflict in many parts of the world. Next slide, please. Okay, let's see how this plays out in a couple of regions of the world. Okay, we'll start up at the top, in the Arctic, where we see temperatures are rising 4 times the global average, sea ice is retreating, permafrost thaw is melting, leading to a whole new navigable region in the Arctic, where President Putin eyes the Northern Sea Route, pictured here in blue, as a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe, and is also militarizing and nuclearizing this region, increasing the demand for U.S. and allied presence in the region. Meanwhile, China eyes the region as a near-Arctic stakeholder and hopes to exploit the energy and minerals of the region, and perhaps in the future, the fish. This is Admiral James Fogo, who has a retired now 4-star, who as a young submariner went up to the Arctic and did this maneuver you see pictured here, where the sub pops up out of the ice. It's called ice pick, and then the sailors can get out and perhaps play a little baseball or don a Santa hat and send some pictures home to the family. Well, then he goes back about 20 years later and now he's in command of the submarine. He tries to do the same maneuver, but when he gets to about the same spot, there's not enough ice. And what he finds is blue water and plastic waste. So that was his experience in a changing Arctic. Okay, next slide. Yeah. Okay, in the Middle East, North Africa region, an area long rich in oil and poor in water. Now drought has led to increased tension and instability. General Tom Mittendorp, pictured here, the former Dutch chief of defense and my partner in the International Military Council on Climate and Security, experienced how prolonged drought leading to water insecurity, water scarcity in his deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Somalia, all were leading to rising and persistent tensions, increasingly hard to reduce, even with the power of security forces. Okay, next slide. And in the Pacific, here, Admiral Locklear, former commander of U.S. Pacific Command, said that climate change is the greatest long-term security threat we face in the Pacific, as he deployed forces increasingly to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the face of increasingly terrifying typhoons across the region. Also, the extreme flooding you see here in places like Bangladesh and throughout the region, that putting whole populations at risk and fueling, as you said, the spread of transnational crime, combining with the extreme events occurring across the region. And next slide. On the next slide, you see that we also have small Pacific Island nations increasingly at peril, such as Kiribati. This is former President Anote Tag of Kiribati, who has talked about migration with dignity, as his population will need to move to higher ground in places like Fiji or Vanuatu, to Australia, because some of the atolls will lose their fresh water and suffer from sea level rise in future years. So how do we maintain that sovereignty, as you talk about? How is that maintained for these small Pacific Island nations as they begin to lose some of their territory? Okay, next slide. And we see growing climate migration around the world, many more people on the move, increasingly displaced, and also children at risk. Next slide. Okay, now I could do a whole section on the Western Hemisphere. I have just this one slide for today, but I hope to learn more from you in the conversation. General Laura Richardson, who I believe just stepped down as the commander of U.S. Southcom. And by the way, all of these are stories told in my book. So they are the stories in each of the chapters. And she increasingly tried to thread awareness of climate risks into the mission set for Southcom of addressing transnational crime, narco trafficking, environmental trafficking, wildlife trafficking, human trafficking, and the other risks in the region, and trying to also increase our preparedness to respond to the extreme events, particularly with the state partnership program that's very active in this region, our National Guard being the primary support to provide support, working with you all in Brazil with the security forces and others throughout the region to address the growing need for responses to extreme weather events. Next slide. Okay, and this is the International Military Council on Climate Security that I co-chair with General Tom Mittendorf, and I hope that you will consider joining us if you haven't already at the center. And we look at addressing the security risks of a changing climate. We've produced a number of world climate security reports. We've had presence at all the NATO public forums, in the public summits, and at the Munich Security Conference, and increasingly want to have presence in the Western Hemisphere. So I hope maybe this will be the beginning of a dialogue with you and others about how to work together to address things from the perspective of your needs in the West, in Brazil and in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, next slide. Okay, let's look now how we deal with climate risk to military bases and energy. Next slide. Okay. As I'm sure you know, military bases themselves are subject to extreme weather events and climate risks. This is a picture of the top of Norfolk Naval Base, the largest U.S. military base, Navy shipyard, all the services, and NATO command headquarters. Admiral Ann Phillips, pictured here, was in command of Expeditionary Strike Group 2 when she had to send her forces to New York to actually relieve the Coast Guard when it got knocked out in Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And Secretary of Defense at the time, Leon Panetta, talked about using our military in the war against nature herself. And this is at the bottom, Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, in the panhandle of Florida, which was flattened in Hurricane Michael in 2018 when the roofs were ripped off the hangars of the F-35, and is now being rebuilt as the Air Force's climate resilient base of the future. Next slide. Okay. So it's not just about our infrastructure, it's also what's happening to troops. Hotter temperatures are affecting troops as they deploy. And as by 2050, the average military installation will experience 33 additional days with a heat index above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, putting troops at risk of heat stress and heat stroke. So increasingly, military readiness depends on protecting our forces and enabling them to operate in the hotter temperatures and through extreme weather events by thinking about hydration, human health, training regimes, and protective equipment. Next slide. And then it all comes down at the end to how we use energy. This is just a picture of how the U.S. Department of Defense uses energy. As you can see, about 2/3 of it is for what we call operational energy, or for our forces. Most of it's for aircraft, and then about 1/3 for military bases. Next slide. So what can we do about it? The focus has been less fuel and more fight. In the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the military learned the hard way that deploying forces to the front meant trucking fuel, and many of those military convoys put soldiers and Marines at risk of deadly attack by improvised explosive devices. That led already a decade ago to a generation of innovation in military energy that has allowed more renewables to be deployed at the front, and looking at better efficiency in use of fuel and fuel types and aircraft design. Next slide. So today, here's one example of a new aircraft design that would be 30% improvement in efficiency, not only reduce fuel demand, but increase global reach. And next slide. And another important way that military bases in particular can decarbonize is by moving to net zero, which is a requirement right now in the US for military bases to be a net zero by 2035 for electricity and 2050 overall. And this is the first net zero military base in Albany, Georgia. It has a microgrid, which many military bases are deploying today to be able to operate off of the main electric grid, and also has this waste to energy plant you see pictured here, where methane is being extracted from an old landfill. Also provides energy resilience so that the base can operate even if there is an attack, a cyber attack, or the grid goes down. Next slide. Okay. All right, to finish up here, so then we can go into so where do we go in the future? How do we climate proof our security? Thank you. And really, there's 4 parts to this in the book. They apply, in how you think together about how do we climate proof security in Brazil, in the region, in general. And they go, and these are the 4 pillars. Awareness, which is really improving our climate prediction so that we have downscale regional models that give us more fidelity. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Then let's talk about adaptation and resilience, making our bases and our troops resilient to climate risks. It's also about decarbonizing, third, mitigation, moving towards net zero military. And then, of course, it's about how we work together and alliances. Okay, next slide. This is a new U.S. framework on climate resilience and security, released just actually a few weeks ago. you might, or last month, you might want to take a look at it. And a lot of it is about closing the gap between weather and climate prediction. So as you see here, weather forecasts are reliable out for days, but as we get more towards long-term climate models, they provide predictions out, forecasts out for decades, but aren't as useful for planning in the 1 to 10 year time frame. And that's where the opportunity really lies now. Every sector of society needs this, from transportation to agriculture, from fisheries to insurance, all need that 1 to 10 year fidelity in prediction. And a lot of that has to do with better understanding the El Nino, La Nino cycles. So some of it's about science, some of it's about modeling, some of it's about AI, some of that's bringing those decision tools together in a way that you all working in either in your think tanks or in the military or in a decision-making role can actually use it to make decisions on everything from military planning and exercises to infrastructure that needs to last and be resilient over decades. Okay, next slide. And I'm going to use this as an example, but I hope this is just an example that we can talk about in the region. NATO now has a new climate change center of excellence on climate and security, where it really has integrated climate change into the mainstream of its mission to meet core objectives of defense and deterrence. And I was privileged to help launch that center last summer at the Washington NATO Summit, and also to speak at the first Montreal Climate and Security Summit. But I think this is a benchmark for where we need to go in militaries overall, now 30 plus NATO member militaries, integrating climate security into the core objectives of defense and deterrence. Okay, next slide. And again, to end on a positive note, because it's we want security, but ultimately we really want peace and peace building. And I was privileged to be recognized earlier this year for with an award on peace building, because I've devoted a lot of my life, and I believe this is the work at the core of climate and security, is to not only help our forces be climate aware, but to lead to better futures by building local and resilient solutions so that we can leave a better future for our children. Okay, next slide. And that is how you can buy my book, which I hope you will. And I'm very happy to take your questions and have a conversation now. Thank you.
Thank you,
A little
Sherri.
louder, please.
Well, thank you so much. That was a very, very interesting and insightful talk. I expect that thought-provoking as well by the questions that we already have here and by the questions that we are gathering through the chat. So, as Mariana told in the beginning, we're starting with some questions from our colleagues from the military institutions and the other partners that help to make this talk to come through. So the first one that we have here is from Nila. It refers to how the US has been integrating climate change and sustainability into its national defense strategy. And what are the main lessons learned that could be shared with other countries as Brazil, particularly thinking that Brazil has some different peculiarities and has a different geopolitical position and environmental assets. Mila is from Centro, Soberania, Clima. And also, we have here a second question that is from Professor Ruben from SM. The nexus between climate change and security, according to him, is undeniable, since climate emergency is an existential threat, at least to shares of our society. However, the main cause of climate change does not come from defense and security. It relies on development. So what would be the consequences of securitizing climate change in international governments, according to you, Sherri? Are you hearing me clearly?
Okay, I hear you, and I hope I understand the two questions. So let me see if I can.
There are three more. Would you like to pick them all, or I would break into another part?
I think I maybe why don't I start with the first two, because otherwise I won't remember the next ones.
No problem. So we break in two, and then we open to the greater audience if that's okay.
Yes. Okay. Okay. On the first question on integrating climate change into defense strategy and military planning, the U.S. today has a substantial effort on what we call climate literacy and education. So at every level of command. So in the military academies, also in the professional military institutions that senior leaders attend, but also at the enlisted level. So at every echelon, for every type of rank, whether it's the individual service or a joint combatant command, there's different types of climate education and training. And I think that is what is going to be really important. It has to become part of your job, and you have to be able to measure and manage it. As we say, you can't manage what you don't measure. One of the things I did in the Department of Defense in the 1990s was we put together the first series of environmental metrics and measures. So we could measure, let's say, how we were cleaning up a military base, or our compliance with air, water, and waste laws, or protecting endangered species. And when militaries are trained to respond to an order and a direct command. And when you give them something to measure, whether it's in your country, how you're operating in a particular training area to minimize deforestation, for example, or your lighter carbon footprint as you're conducting your training. All of those measures, as they are integrated throughout the command, then become routine. And in fact, that's also one of the major contributions that NATO, as a security alliance, is making in this area. NATO has long operated with standards, and the forces need to be what people call interoperable. In other words, a German tank and a US tank have to be able to talk to each other, but they also have to use common fuel. So now, as you think about, decarbonizing, you want to have a common set of standards and measures. And that's one of the most important things that NATO is doing now, is developing these climate standards, or they're called STANAGs for short, but standards that will in the future provide this rigorous both way to measure emissions, but also to decarbonize. Okay, on the question, the second question, securitization. Some people talk about securitization of climate. I talk about climatization of security. Climatization of security. Because I think when I hear the framing about securitization of climate, it seems to reflect a concern that militaries will be overly involved in solving the climate problem and the climate emergency and challenge. Let me be very clear. Militaries alone are not going to solve climate. That's not their role. Militaries can and should get their house in order in terms of their own emissions. But even in the US, where we have a large military, it's only about 1% of US energy. And so while the military should lead by example in the way it uses energy, it's really going to be the rest of society that determines how quickly we develop, for example, sustainable aviation fuels, or sustainable maritime fuels, or better batteries. And then when you think about what are the solutions to climate risks at the local level, how do you build resilience in societies? the military should be an important partner, but only a partner. This has to be led by diplomacy, development, by NGOs, by governments in the civilian sector, where militaries are the supporting partner. So that's how I think about it. And that's why I think the most sustainable peace building solutions are going to be where the military, at best, is a supporting partner, where it leads by example, but is not, and maybe provide some convening power, transportation, the things it's good at, logistics, but recognizing that the strategy and the vision comes from those who can see what the future is going to be in the civilian sector.
That's brilliant, Sherri. Thank you. So, going to the last questions that we have from this first batch. How can climate change be considered a multiple threat to national security and defense? And how can militaries and agencies adapt their strategies and capabilities to respond to the challenges posed by extreme weather events, geopolitical instability, and forced migration? This question was from Cynthia Sanders. She's a professor from Brazilian Defense College. The other one that I have here is like, considering the context of COP29 and the beginning of G20 in Brazil, how can the armed forces of G20 countries contribute to mitigating threats arising from climate change in your view? This question was from Professor Jacinto Maia from Brazilian College. And the last one, I think you hinted a bit on that, particularly thinking about the climatization of security. But Rafael Lima, my colleague from King's College London, he asked, how can we share a proper balance between benefiting from military capabilities on the one hand and avoiding a dependency on military assets on the other hand, when dealing with rising environmental security threats to national security? Up to you, Sherri.
Okay, I have to say, I'm not sure I really heard or understood the first question. It was a little bit, it was a little bit garbled on my end, so I'm not sure I know what to answer. So why don't I answer the other two, and then if you want to restate the first question in the next round. Okay, on COP29 and G20 in Brazil, I mean, look, the current COP seems to be somewhat not as ambitious and not as optimistic as the one last year in Dubai, that's for sure. And now we have the whole election in the United States that sends a whole nother level of unpredictability into the system. You're getting ready to host the next COP, which is important, extremely important, and you have an opportunity, I think, to showcase, a lot of different elements on that, from finance, climate finance, sustainability, resilience, and even security, on what the G20 militaries can do on climate. I mean, the G20 obviously is not focused primarily on the defense sector. It's focused on the much broader and larger economies of the G20. So if the G20 members, have a commitment to sustainability and to lead by example in their own economies, that should be reflected in what militaries, do and how they get their own house in order. Again, I don't want to overstate the role of the militaries in any sector of society. They have defined missions, to protect and defend the nation, and to operate as good stewards of the natural resources for where they operate, and to reduce pollution and to be sustainable and to be climate aware and responsible. Which gets to really the next question on, the benefits and risks of increasing reliance on the military to respond to rising extreme weather events. Well, and when we do have some, like if you look at, we're using something called the Military Response to Climate Hazards Tracker, which you could see on the website for the Center for Climate and Security, which is the U.S. host institution for the International Military Council on Climate Security, something called MERCH. I can try to put it in the chat if you, and we track responses of militaries around the world to climate hazards. And what's very clear is that militaries around the world are increasingly being called on to respond to floods, fires, extreme weather events in their home country, whether it's, flooding across in your, in Brazil or other parts of Latin America, or fires in Greece recently, or fires in the U.S. I mean, there's a large increase in the number of U.S. National Guard being called up to respond to fires in the Western United States in recent years. Okay, so how do you deal with that? Well, you can either grow the, first, the most obvious thing is you got to reduce those risks, right? So you want to reduce the fire, the flood, the extreme weather events. Okay, we're not doing so well at that generally as society. So how do you have more robust capability in your civilian sector? You can increase the number of emergency responders at the local level. Also we have, as we say, our Guard and Reserve. I'm sure you have the equivalent, that are basically civilians who are called up periodically to support the military. And now they're increasingly called up to respond to these events. I think that, I see this continuing mission and mission for the military. I don't see any foreseeable future in which that mission will be reduced, and that's why I think climate education and literacy is so important.
Absolutely. I think I already responded, because what I understood from my colleague's question is that we are assuming that climate change poses multiple threats, but I suppose that her question was more how to translate that into strategy, into ways of responding to these threats from the military perspective. So yeah, that was brilliant. There's a colleague of ours, Professor Rubens, who would like to ask you another question. Then Rubens, the floor is yours to ask.
Yes, if I may. So, Sherri, many thanks for the opportunity to listen to you and to make elaborate a question for you. So, I'm wondering, very, very straightforward question: how can we cope with the growing denialism in society and therefore within military as well? How to convince them to lead by example in this situation? Is climate education enough to do so?
I mean, Rubens, it's a great question. In the U.S. right now, we've just had massive mis and disinformation campaigns that have been, very much a part of the recent election, and I don't see that going away. I think that so many people are misinformed about so many things today, and they get their information increasingly in these little silos on from the internet, from their different, protected sources that may then be providing them with inaccurate information. And I think, unfortunately, people in this area, and particularly philanthropies and even educators like yourselves, have to think about how are you communicating the work you do, the research and analysis. Is it enough today? Is it enough to do your research, to do your analysis, to be talking like in a group like this of, informed educators, experts, and think tanks when you're missing a large part of society. You know, when I started this work almost 20 years ago now on climate change and security with generals and admirals, we knew we had to reach across the aisle and sort of talk to people at the time we thought of as climate skeptics. And sometimes the military voice in the US was effective because they could go into, let's say, conservative areas of the United States or elsewhere and meet with people. But today, that's almost not enough, right? Because people are getting their information, and there's, you know, the campaigns that were fueled, let's say, in the recent election cycle, just in the last 2 weeks, by Elon Musk to flood the zone with mis and disinformation are, it's undermining many aspects of society. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I must say we have to be aware of it. I think that many of us haven't been focused enough on that because it requires a whole, somewhat of a different communications approach than we've thought of in the past. And it may not just be about the facts and the evidence.
That's really very. Very briefly, before I go to the audience questions, my colleague Duncan wants to ask you one last question for our batch of initial questions. Duncan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamiris. Thank you, Sherri, for that presentation. So my question is around, given the uncertainties around the scale and pace of the global energy transition, do you think there is strategic and operational advantage in moving away from fossil fuels and being a kind of a more climate conscious military? Or is this too much of a risk while other countries are persisting with their fossil fuel consumption?
Well, Duncan, we often talk about how it's more about the mission than emissions. So it's not about decarbonizing for its own sake in the military, but it's about understanding where there can be strategic or tactical advantage from powering your force in a different way. As an example, rather than trucking fuel to the front, you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan, or in the next maritime conflict with China, if you can reduce your supply line by having better, you know, advanced batteries, or more global reach, as I showed in the example of the blended body wing design, you can improve your military effectiveness. So it's about being smart about how to achieve military effectiveness on different types of energy sources. So if you're blindly just saying, well, I don't like renewables, I'm just going to power myself with fossil fuels, you may miss the opportunity to achieve a quieter hybrid electric vehicle because you know, you've ignored that opportunity. So it's not as if the military is going to go off fossil fuels anytime soon. That is, you know, not happening, but neither is it happening across most of our societies. At the same time, we can decarbonize. We have to think about what are the opportunities for improved effectiveness of the force across a whole range of energy and fuel types.
That's brilliant, Sherri. We have 9 questions from the Q&A, so I will direct you 3 each time if you prefer. Okay. So the first one, I can't localize the name of the person, but it refers to the US military family already suffering from food insecurity. In your opinion, will this trend worsen with climate change? The other question is from Maria Carolina. What do you expect for the coming years at a national and a global level, considering the reality of climate change, but also Donald Trump's denialism with his promise to strengthen protectionist policies and withdraw from climate agreements? The next one is from Bruno Ferreira, a PhD student from King's College. His research is about the oceanic islands and their strategic value for maritime security. He asked the following: what's your opinion about the relation between the military bases in these islands and the environment? Is it possible both to exist together?
Okay. On food insecurity, yeah, I do think this is an area where in the US, some of the enlisted forces and families, have been have been at the times when they're at the entry level more food insecure. So I think this is an area about which there has been some attention. In fact, I'm involved with an organization called Blue Star Families that helps support military families and provides, among many other things, food and other equipment and material to military families around the country. I think this is an area likely to get more attention than many others who are food insecure in society because there's concern about military families. But it has been an area that unfortunately we've had to pay attention to. And then there's the whole question about diets in the US and all of that, but we won't get into that right now. Okay, so about climate denial. Well, Trump considered climate change to be a 4-letter word in his first term. So I think we'll go back to some of that now. It's unfortunate that we're demonizing either climate or, demonizing oil and gas doesn't lead to any productive conversation either. I mean, the goal is to think about what are the risks and then reduce those risks. So, I think we're headed, for another period of disruption and unpredictability with the incoming administration. I think that's all I'll say about that. And then maritime security, what's my opinion about the relation between military bases, and small islands. I mean, obviously, if you think about either the Caribbean or certainly the Pacific of strategic importance to U.S. presence in the region, and then you have very sensitive ecosystems and fragile environments, the military has a responsibility there to understand their footprint as they operate. In the past, sometimes hasn't done so well. I will certainly acknowledge that. And it's had to do a lot of cleanup at, bases in the Pacific and even bases in the Caribbean and elsewhere. I think that, with the right kind of training and awareness, that can be done, that can be improved. And I've seen a lot of improvement over my lifetime.
That's brilliant, Sherri. Wow, I'm going for the next questions that we have here. José Pinheiro de Andrade Lima, thank you for the presentation. This question is about what if COVID-19 pandemics left as lessons learned in terms of facing new threats in regard to climate and all these threats to ecosystems and biodiversity. The other question comes from Romeo Ferreira Emídio. He's a researcher at IBGE here in Brazil. His question is about the current mechanisms and challenges regarding how to have some data systems about this climate change nexus. So what are the current mechanisms in terms of data and data systems in this regard? So the other question is from João Paulo Pereira. What do you think NATO can do in order to strengthen their ambition towards reaching net zero emissions until 2050? What are the main challenges that are still need to be addressed?
Okay. On the first question on COVID, and pandemics, I mean, was very, one of the main lessons from COVID was that biosecurity threats are real and they will continue to increase. And we were underprepared for that. And that can also be, we're not only in a climate crisis, but we're in a biodiversity crisis now. And so as we look at the, growing threats to global biodiversity, and of course you live in one of the most biodiverse and important regions of the world, how do you manage in and through that? And so we have to connect those two in the way that, in the 1990s, we were thinking about environment, about environmental contamination and then natural resources, but then climate came later. Biodiversity and ecosystem as a connected thread of sort of ecological security is really the future here as we think about not just climate security, but a broader frame of ecological security that includes biodiversity, that recognizes the importance of our natural systems, our earth systems, everything from fisheries to forests, and what they contribute to health and well-being. And understanding that broader frame and why it's important to reduce eco trafficking, wildlife trafficking, overfishing, and why that also poses security risks. Particularly, I think the area that's gotten maybe more attention than some others in recent years is the threats of over and illegal fishing around the world and how that undermines food security for so many people. And I think that, and then if we think about the role, let's say the role of the militaries in that, they're not the primary role. And let's say in the US, it's a Coast Guard mission to deal with illegal fishing. But sometimes when it becomes of such significant magnitude, like the piracy we saw off the coast of West Africa some years hence, it involves, the navies, let's say, supporting the Coast Guard, where you have increased illegal fishing. Okay. On the question of data, if I understood the question right, we have so much data in the world today from all of the ways we create it in through AI and through increased satellites and observations. So you have data and observations, but you also have to have decision tools. And that's sort of I think, where we are on the cusp of these climate intelligence tools, essentially. Precision tools for climate decision making that, as I said, close this 1 to 10 year gap so that you can know, farmers can have a better view of what kind of crops should you plant next year or 2 years from now. What's going to be resilient in, let's say, agriculture in hotter temperatures or more extreme weather events or more drought conditions. And it's understanding that as an example that we need to have more of in every sector. As to what NATO can do and should do, again, I think it's most in this area of leaning on climate, environment, and the energy transition. Its most enduring capability is going to be in reforming these standards that enable military forces to be interoperable. It sounds sort of boring, but it is at the heart of what militaries do. And so if you can move militaries onto a new generation of sustainable fuels, or you have different standards by which they operate, and that affects 30 plus member militaries around the world, you've already sort of shifted the conversation some to a more sustainable future.
Sherri, thank you so much. I'm handing over to Mariana because I am in a very noisy environment, and I'm mindful that several people are having some difficulties to understand
Yeah, I'm having
here.
a little difficulty hearing you, I'll say.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Sherri. So we have a question from Paulo Vitor Batista Santos. It's another question about the G20. He asks, how can the G20 strengthen collaboration among its members to integrate climate change issues into national security strategies, considering the geopolitical risks and economic implications associated with climate disasters and forced migrations?
Well, okay. Did you want me to take that question?
Yes, yes. Then
Okay. Okay, thank you. Well, I think unfortunately, I don't see the US right now leading on that subject, but I do think other members of the G20 can put that more front and center for addressing the risks to societies and our countries and the G20 economies of increasing migration from climate change. And I do think those solution sets then go to how we think about reforming climate finance. I think we have to recognize, and this I think is going to be interesting question now for Brazil, which is the host of the next COP. But increasingly, I think that we are finding that how we confront climate risks is not going to be determined primarily through what happens at the big climate conferences and negotiations, because that has become a frustrating diplomatic dance with a lot of different threads leading to a lot of posturing and a lot of it's not necessarily producing the solutions that others envisioned. And it could be that the G20 or other smaller groupings of key countries is better able to advance solutions or future directions on climate. So I think it's a great question. Again, I wouldn't say that I'm the world's expert on that area. My focus has been more on security, and this is much more in the heart of how we think about our economic institutions. But I do think it's something worth thinking about. And you now have, because of your experience in the G20 and also being the host of the next COP, you probably, as Brazil and with others, have a lot to contribute in thinking through perhaps some better future directions for climate action.
Thank you, Sherri. We have another one from Jeffrey Duke. He asks, climate change being a global security issue, how do we draw a meaningful balance between global imperatives to take actions on climate change and sovereignty as it relates to voluntary actions by states?
Well, that's what nationally determined commitments was supposed to do in the context of a global climate agreement. And you could say progress on that has been, the goals are good, but the progress towards achieving them has been sort of less than desired. So, what's the right balance? I mean, I think some of this there's always a cultural component to this, because what sovereignty means in the context of a discussion in Brazil might be different than what sovereignty means in the context of discussion in another country. And so I think we have to be aware of that. I think that there's no one size fits all here. So I think we have to be careful about having mandates of when we think about climate as a security issue or environment as a security issue. Okay, I'll tell you a story. When I held in the 1990s, in the first Western Hemisphere Defense Environmental Security conference I held with then General Wesley Clark of Southcom and leaders from across the region, from Brazil, across every military and foreign ministry and a lot of environmental ministries. And at this conference, which was held in Miami at the time, and one of the news stories that came out of the Brazilian reporting was, oh, there's this conference going on in environmental security, and it's really about the American military trying to take over the Amazon. Okay, so now, nothing could have been further from the truth. That conference was not designed, was not about the US military going into the Amazon. But that reflected a long-standing sort of societal concern, let's say in Brazil, about its sovereignty being impaired by the US military, for example, in that case. So I think, that was, that's something we all have to be aware of. That's, you have a hypersensitivity to that about the Amazon in Brazil. And, that's something to be aware of, but also at the same time to recognize as we talk about what the right balance is in Brazil, may be different than what the balance is in Macedonia or in other countries. And because, we all bring our own past and personal experiences to bear in any setting, we have to be aware of that. And then the more we can engage, the more we can, then we're able to have a real meaningful dialogue that maybe gets beyond just labeling.
Thank you, Sherri. We have another question from Carolina Rafagnato. She asks, how can defense prepare for natural disasters caused by climate change? How does the military interface with disaster response already function in the US? And what opportunities for improvement do you see?
Right. Okay, that's a great question. We've seen over the last decade and a half that, let's say in the US, the military is more frequently called up to respond to floods, hurricanes, fires. And so it's, first of all, it's already gaining that experience because it's getting called up. Now, that also allows the military then to go back and do a lessons learned on, does it have the right equipment and the right training for the increasing what we call demand signal to respond to natural disasters. So, does it have the right firefighting equipment? Does it have the right equipment and lift to respond to supporting search and rescues in floods and hurricanes? And I think that work is increasingly being done, certainly in our National Guard, but also in the active duty forces. Militaries, the good thing about militaries is that they are planning and learning organizations. So when they can understand those lessons and go back, I think increasingly our forces are better prepared to respond to that. And why I also think these improved predictive capabilities, these new decision tools are so important is because, as an example, we now have a fire season year-round in the US, and increasingly militaries are called up to respond to fires in the West. I mean, I was just in California 2 weeks ago, and there was another fire going on, and the Guard was being called up. So now we have new satellite capabilities that can provide better downlinks and more real-time data and information about where those fires are, where they're occurring, where they're spreading, how intense they are. And that enables firefighters to do their job in a better way. And so increasingly, and then there's all sorts of AI technologies, digital twins and others to sort of do sort of war gaming or planning or scenario exercises about how certain events will play out so that you can be better prepared. And I think that's where militaries and security forces, as well as first responders, should be looking at how do we better exercise and train our people using the new data and intelligence tools that are available to us so that we are better prepared for that next extreme weather event.
Thank you, Sherri. I'm going to make two other questions, and I think that they are somehow related. One is from, again, from Paulo Vito. He asks, how climate change impact the political and social stability of a country, and how does this affect national security? And the other one is from Juvencio, who asks, no, that's not the other one that I want, sorry. And the other one is from Newton, who asks, how can we promote climate justice and ensure that the most vulnerable countries receive the support they need to adapt to climate change and mitigate its impacts?
Okay, I'll take the last ones for on climate justice. That has been a part of this administration, the current U.S. administration's policies, both in the U.S. and internationally. That U.S. framework I referred to in my talk also includes a section of connecting the stability of states with resilience of communities. That's a newer concept when you think about security, because security traditionally has been about security among states, or we talk about non-state actors like terrorists. But when you think about resilience of communities, that's often been seen to be something just happening at the local level. But climate justice, invites one to think about how you have food and, how you repair food and water insecurity, and also how you address systemic inequality. Now, that's easier to do within a country, and there's a long way to go within the US, and it's not going to get a lot of attention in the next administration. All those offices will go away, that's for sure. I forget what was the first question, Mariana?
How can climate change impact the political and social stability of a country, and how does this affect national security?
Well, I mean, we see it, let's just say as an example, the hurricanes that occurred in the US just prior to the election, Hurricane Helene and Milton, that cut a path through Florida and also North Carolina, then led to massive sort of disinformation and, if you will, almost instability around those deeply affected areas, as you saw people demonizing the federal emergency response managers. And so I think that can lead, certainly we know that climate can affect voting. That's been clear now in a number of countries, and including in the US. And so we see climate, extreme events sort of undermining the integrity of institutions. I mean, it's part of what's happening. It's in the US right now. It doesn't explain all of what's happening, but certainly the fact that local regions are increasingly stressed when they suffer extreme weather events, makes them more vulnerable to dis and misinformation. And then there's now a whole wave in the US of sort of saying, well, government doesn't help us, government can't serve us, let's just break up the whole thing. Okay, and I'm just going to tell you something honestly. Look, my parents are Holocaust refugees. My parents were born in Germany in the early 1930s. They were among the fortunate few who were able to escape. But many perished. 6 million died, more. And partly it's because in that case, a whole society was willing to support Hitler and turn against its established institutions and turn against many innocent people in society. And we see some of those threads throughout many of our countries today. Definitely there's an undercurrent of that in the US right now. And it's deeply troubling, very deeply troubling. So I wish I had a better answer to it. I think the best answer is to be aware and to be vigilant, and to stay in the arena. If you sit on the sidelines because it just becomes too difficult to engage, as many people are, I think, I'll say in the US now, people are just kind of so fed up. They're just like, just going to retreat to my own corner. But unfortunately, that could lead to things getting even worse. So that's Sherri's personal reflection there.
Thank you so much, Sherri. We have two more questions. One is from Juvencio, and he asks, what kind of strategies can be implemented to convince politicians to climatize defense policies? And the other one is from Mila, that also works at the Climate and Sovereign Center. And Mila, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sherri, for your presentation. And I would like to ask about the academic impact of your research, because we know that the policy impact is undeniable and etc. But how would you describe this impact of your conceptual contribution to the academic field, especially when we consider the limits between security and strategic studies?
Okay, Mila, thank you very much for that. I'm going to answer that question first. I think that it's a really good. Thank you for that. I think that the work that myself and others have done over decades now has helped really create and lay the foundation for the academic work in this area. Because it's allowed, I mean, you now see whole courses, whole parts of universities that are focused on the climate and environmental and sustainability aspects of security. It's a very popular field of academic pursuit, regardless of how you think about it. I mean, and that's how academics sort of make their mark, is by taking what's out there and then building on it or disputing the person before. So when somebody writes an article, beyond the threat multiplier, I'm like, great, okay, you're thinking, okay, what's the next phase? What's the next chapter? And I give a lot of lectures on this at universities, especially in the US, but now like with you all, I think it's helped create a whole new field of serious academic pursuit in the security studies field. So it's not just seen as, oh yeah, it's you guys do environment over there, but we're the hard security types here. Now it's part of the mainstream. Sometimes you say it's at the big kids' table, but I think I always started out, and the reason I started out in nuclear weapons in my early career is because I wanted to be working in the things that were considered the hardcore security risks of the era in which I came of age. And so now I think climate is one of those hardcore risks. It has to be. If you ignore it at your own peril. Let me say, I don't think the Chinese are ignoring it. They may have different views on it than we do, different views than the American administration, but it's not like they're ignoring it. They're in fact going to use it likely to their strategic and tactical advantage in various ways. So I think we have to think about that. And I'm glad for your, that you're making this part of your security studies curriculum and research. And now I forgot what the other question was.
The other one was, what kind of strategies can be implemented to convince politicians to climatize defense policies?
Well, okay, in the US, I mean, we saw a lot of that happening over the last 4 years. Now we'll probably see less of it let's say in the US in the incoming administration. I do think, though, that increasing extreme weather events affect everyone. It's not where you are in the political spectrum. So, and I think particularly, let's say in the US and everywhere, everyone wants to protect their military bases and protect their troops, right? So when you think about, our troops have to operate in hotter temperatures or through floods, or in the Arctic, in the Arctic in colder temperatures. So they have to be properly equipped. We call it man trained and equipped, but we have to understand heat stroke, for example, as I talked about, and then also protecting our military bases from increasing climate risk. Those are the areas I think that are easiest in many ways to attract support across a range of differing views about climate.
Sherri, thank you so much for answering all the questions that our audience had. And thank you so much for being with us today. For us here in Brazil, it's such a great opportunity for listening to you, from you, learning from you. We don't have always that kind of opportunity in here. So it was an amazing lecture, and we are very pleased with you for that. Thank you, Duncan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mariana. And thank you, Sherri, just to echo everything Mariana said there. It's been an absolute privilege to be able to listen to you talk about your book, and congratulations on that again. And also thank you to our audience for such illuminating questions and prompting the discussion and engaging with us. So with that, we are coming to the end of our time now. So we will draw this event to a conclusion, but we will, as I said at the start, be continuing with this series of work. And please do keep track of the website of the Centre of Sovereignty and Climate to make sure that you are keeping track of events, but also you'll be able to access recordings and reports from all of these events. So with that, thank you to all of our colleagues and partners. Thank you again, Sherri, and everyone. Wish everyone a very good rest of your days. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. And I hope to have the opportunity to come visit you in Brazil at some point. I've only been there once, so I'm really due for another trip.
That will be great. Maybe we have the opportunity in COP30.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would be a great pleasure, honor, or maybe that would be terrific. And I hope you read the book, and I'd be really interested to hear from you when you do, what you think, and if you have other questions, just please let me know. Thank you for what you all do, and Mariana, Duncan, we can follow up on IMCCS at any time.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Sherri.
Thank you again, Sherri.
All right.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone. Thank you.